If you ever added something from your kitchen to lavender, thinking you were giving a little extra help, there's an important question to ask first. What is that ingredient actually doing to the root zone? Lavender isn't a heavy feeder. In fact, it generally performs best when the soil stays lean, dry, and sharply drained. So an ingredient that sounds nutritious can sometimes be completely unnecessary, or even work against the conditions lavender needs. But that doesn't mean everything from your kitchen is useless. There are several ordinary ingredients that can have a legitimate place around lavender, depending on what they contain, how they're used, and whether your plant is growing in the ground or container. And there's one ingredient in particular that sounds harmless, is recommended surprisingly often, and can create a root zone problem when gardeners use too much of it. So rather than simply asking, is this natural? We're going to look at what each ingredient actually does and why that distinction matters for lavender. The first ingredient is one that sounds almost too ordinary to matter. Finished compost made from kitchen scraps. But there's an important distinction here. Lavender doesn't need rich soil in the way a tomato or squash plant does. In fact, too much fertility can push lavender towards soft, leafy growth at the expense of the compact, flowering habit we actually want. What makes good compost useful is less about feeding lavender and more about improving the soil around its roots. A small amount of mature compost can add organic matter and help create air spaces in the soil, particularly useful when you're establishing lavender in a garden bed. And that word, mature, matters. Fresh vegetable scraps belong in the compost pile, not directly around the lavender. Until those materials have decomposed, they can create moisture, attract pests, and behave very differently from finished compost. The second ingredient is more controversial. Use coffee grounds. They do contain nitrogen and other compounds that soil microorganisms can use. But here's the part most gardening advice gets wrong. Use coffee grounds are not a reliable way to acidify soil. After brewing, their acidity is much lower than many gardeners assume. For lavender, that makes coffee grounds a soil conditioning ingredient, not a special bloom fertilizer. And moderation is crucial. A thick layer can interfere with water movement and temporarily tie up nitrogen as microbes break the material down. So if you use them, think small amounts, preferably incorporated into compost rather than dump in a pile around the plant. And the next ingredient takes this idea even further, because it contains a nutrient lavender can use, but not necessarily in the way you've been told. That nutrient is potassium, which brings us to our third kitchen ingredient, banana peels. You've probably heard the classic advice. Bury a banana peel beside your plant and let the potassium do its work. The reality is more interesting. A fresh banana peel is not a fast, predictable potassium fertilizer. It has to break down first. And simply burying a peel beside lavender can introduce more organic material and moisture than this dry-loving plant actually needs. But put that same peel into a well-managed compost pile, and the situation changes. Once decomposed, it becomes part of broader organic material that can contribute nutrients and improve soil structure. And that fits lavender much better than leaving a wet piece of fruit waste against the plant's crown. There's another reason I prefer this approach. Lavender generally has modest nutrient requirements. University guidance specifically warns that over-fertilization can produce more foliage and fewer flowers. So the lesson with banana peels isn't, lavender needs bananas. It's this. The form of the ingredient matters. If you want to recycle banana peels, compost them first rather than treating the peel itself like a fertilizer pellet. And our next ingredient sounds even more convincing because it contains a mineral that plants genuinely need. But that doesn't mean sprinkling it around lavender is automatically a good idea. That mineral is calcium, and the fourth kitchen ingredient is crushed eggshells. But this is where the usual gardening advice needs a little correction. Eggshells are mostly calcium carbonate, which is essentially a form of lime. The problem is that crushed shells break down very slowly, especially when they're left in larger pieces. So sprinkling eggshells around lavender is not a quick calcium treatment, and it certainly isn't a guaranteed way to produce more flowers. Where they can make sense is very specific. If your soil is genuinely acidic and you need a mild, slow source of calcium carbonate, finely ground eggshells can contribute to that process. But lavender generally prefers soil that is around neutral to mildly alkaline, so blindly adding a limey material can move the soil in the wrong direction. This is why a soil test is more useful than guessing. And notice the pattern developing here. The kitchen ingredient itself isn't automatically good or bad. Its value depends on what the soil actually needs. That becomes especially important in containers. A small pot has a limited root zone, and adding materials simply because they contain a useful mineral can gradually change that environment without giving you much benefit. So if your lavender is already growing well in reasonably neutral, well-drained soil, eggshells are probably unnecessary. Our fifth ingredient takes a completely different approach. Instead of trying to feed lavender directly, it can help create the kind of soil environment where lavender roots function better, but only when you use it in the right form. That fifth ingredient is used tea leaves. Like coffee grounds, tea leaves are sometimes treated as a special fertilizer for acid-loving plants. But lavender is an acid-loving plant, and that distinction matters. Used tea leaves are better understood as a small source of organic material than as a targeted lavender fertilizer. Once composted, they can become part of the finished organic matter going back into the garden. But putting thick layers of wet tea leaves directly around lavender isn't a shortcut to healthier growth. There's another detail gardeners sometimes overlook. What was actually in the cup. Plain black or green tea is one thing. Tea bags may contain paper, synthetic fibers, flavorings, or other materials that you don't necessarily want decomposing in the soil. And sweetened tea is an entirely different matter. So if you're recycling plain used tea leaves, composting them first is a more conservative approach. And by now, you may be noticing something important. These kitchen materials aren't magic lavender food. Their value is mostly indirect, through compost, organic matter, or correcting a genuine soil deficiency. That brings us to ingredient number 6. And this one has an especially useful connection to soil structure, because sometimes the best thing you can add around lavender isn't another nutrient at all. It's material that helps turn a dense, poorly structured planting area into a root zone with more air and better drainage. And that's where one very ordinary kitchen leftover becomes surprisingly useful, but only after it's gone through the right process. That sixth ingredient is vegetable scraps, but only after they become compost. Things like carrot ends, leafy greens, and other plain vegetable trimmings can eventually become useful organic matter. But the distinction between food waste and finished compost is critical. Fresh scraps are still decomposing. They contain a lot of water, can attract insects, and can create an unnecessarily damp pocket around a plant that prefers dry, well-aerated soil. Finished compost is different. When organic material has properly decomposed, it can improve soil structure and create better air spaces around the roots. And that is particularly relevant for lavender planted in a garden bed where the native soil is compacted or poorly structured. Research-based extension guidance specifically recommends coarse compost when preparing soil for lavender because improving airspace and drainage helps establishment. But there's a catch. More compost isn't automatically better. Lavender has relatively low nutritional needs, and over-fertilization can encourage excessive foliage rather than the compact, flowering growth gardeners want. So this is a soil preparation tool, not something to pile around an established plant every few weeks. And that brings us to ingredient number 7, because it follows the same principle but with an important difference. The useful part isn't really the kitchen waste itself. It's what happens after microorganisms transform it. Once you understand that, the final ingredient makes much more sense, and it also sets up the one kitchen ingredient I would be particularly careful about using around lavender. The 7th is a little different. Plain rice water. You'll find plenty of claims that rice water is a natural fertilizer, but I would be careful with that wording. There isn't strong evidence that routinely watering lavender with rice water produces a meaningful improvement in growth or flowering. So why mention it at all? Because if you have plain, unsalted rice rinsing water, using a small amount occasionally in the garden is unlikely to provide the dramatic effects sometimes claimed online, but it should not replace proper watering, and I wouldn't use it as a regular fertilizer for lavender. That distinction matters because lavender is one of those plants where doing less can actually be better. If the plant is in heavy soil, staying wet after rain, or sitting in a poorly drained container, no kitchen ingredient is going to solve the underlying problem. Adding more organic material or nutrients can sometimes make the root zone even more complicated. And now we've reached the more important lesson behind all 7 ingredients. The useful kitchen materials we've discussed are mostly useful indirectly, conditionally, or after proper decomposition. None of them turns lavender into a heavy feeding plant. But there is one very common kitchen ingredient where the problem isn't insufficient decomposition, weak nutrients, or lack of evidence. The problem is something much simpler: salt. And this is where a harmless-looking kitchen remedy can begin changing the root zone in a way lavender really doesn't appreciate. And that brings us to the kitchen ingredient I would not recommend using as a routine lavender treatment: salt. The reason is straightforward. Lavender can tolerate relatively lean soil, but its roots still have a function in a balanced soil-water environment. When soluble salts accumulate around those roots, they can make it harder for the plant to take up water. Even when the soil itself is moist, that risk becomes more important in containers, where there is less soil to dilute whatever you add and fewer opportunities for salts to move away from the root zone. So, don't use table salt as a fertilizer, pest treatment, or general soil amendment for lavender. And be especially cautious with homemade remedies that contain salty kitchen leftovers. The bigger lesson from all 7 ingredients is actually much simpler. Lavender doesn't need a kitchen full of fertilizers. It needs a right root environment, plenty of sun, excellent drainage, sensible watering, and soil that isn't overloaded with nutrients or organic waste. So before adding anything, check the plant itself. Is the soil staying wet? Is the container draining freely? Is the plant already growing strongly? If those basics are right, you may not need an ingredient at all. And that's perhaps the most useful kitchen gardening lesson of all. Natural doesn't automatically mean beneficial. The right material in the right form for the right soil is what matters. If this helped you understand your lavender a little better, consider subscribing for more evidence-based gardening lessons.